In the last mini lecture, I talked about the president as a foreign policy leader. I talked about the commander-in-chief role. You should know that Congress declares war constitutionally. However, usually the president decides when and where to engage in the use of force abroad without a declaration of war. You should also know that the War Powers Resolution was an attempt by Congress to reassert its war-making powers, although I don't think it's very effective. In the chief diplomat's role, there are a couple of roles that you should know. First, treaties are made with the advice and consent of the Senate, which is almost always given. I think I told you 99% of the time when the Senate has voted on a treaty submitted by the president, they have approved it. Second, presidents have the power to recognize foreign nations, and I gave you the example of Franklin Roosevelt in the Soviet Union and Richard Nixon in China. The fifth, the last of the roles that I want to talk about is the chief legislator role. And there are really four potential exam questions here, three of which are in the notes, and one comes from the book, and I'll just give it away because it'll be in the mix of questions potentially for the next exam. When we look at the Constitution, it appears that it is the Congress that has the initiative, that the Congress goes ahead and makes laws, and the president either signs the bill, which makes it a law, or the president has this incredibly powerful weapon called the veto. In Latin, veto means to forbid, and it is an awesome weapon. One of the questions that I'm likely to ask on the exam is about what percentage of presidential vetoes have been overridden by the Congress, and it's about 4%. There have been a little over 2,500, it's getting closer to 2,600 now, vetoes, and a little over 100 of them have been overridden by Congress. So it's very, very difficult. 96% of the time, when the president says no, it sticks. So that is, 96% success is very, very effective. Now, the reason that the veto is such an impressive and powerful weapon is it's very difficult for the Congress to override a veto. The second potential question you might see coming from the chief legislator role is two-thirds majorities in both houses of Congress are needed to override. Not two-thirds in one house, two-thirds in both houses, and it's very, very difficult. The third question, if you follow along, is who cast the most vetoes of any president in American history? And the answer is Franklin Roosevelt. He cast 635 vetoes. In other words, this man cast almost 25% of the vetoes cast by all presidents in the history of our country. Now, when people think about a veto, they usually think, well, vetoes are there when we have divided government. If you have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, or a Republican president and a Democratic Congress. To me, what's intriguing about Franklin Roosevelt is that all 12 years this man was president, he had large majorities in both the House and the Senate, which means this man was casting vetoes against a Congress of his own party. And of the 635 vetoes that were cast by Franklin Roosevelt, Congress was only able to override 9 of them. That's it. In other words, Franklin Roosevelt went to war with Congress 635 times, and he won 626 of them, and he only lost 9. So that's really, really impressive. So the veto is an awesome weapon. Only 4% of vetoes have been overridden. The reason that the veto is so formidable is it requires two-thirds majorities, and Roosevelt cast by far the most vetoes of any president in our nation's history. The one thing that I left out that I think is really noteworthy in this area from your book, and I think I should have included it in the notes, and so that's why I would ask you to write this down either in the margin if you have printed up your notes, or in your notebook if you haven't. And that is the State of the Union address. The State of the Union address is an annual report to the nation by the president, essentially unveiling his legislative proposals for addressing national problems. And usually the State of the Union has two components. About half of it is attempting to score political points by talking about the accomplishments of the previous year. And then about half of the speech are the things that we intend to do and the initiatives that we want to address and unveil during the next year. Up until Woodrow Wilson, this was a written report. It is now televised. It is a very dramatic event. And certainly the State of the Union address is an opportunity for the president to really play out this role as chief legislator. And certainly the 20th century is littered with presidential labels on broad legislative proposals, whether it is Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, or whether it is John Kennedy's New Frontier, or whether it is Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Certainly we see the president unveiling broad and sometimes very widespread agendas that have changed the history of our country. So the State of the Union is a platform for the president to do that. If you move down the notes on the page, we then move to presidential staffing. And there are essentially two forms of staffing. The first is what I would call the traditional mode or the traditional method of staffing, and that's the cabinet. Now, put some stars next to the fact that the cabinet is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. You can't find any mention of the cabinet anywhere, and yet it is an innovation that dates back to the beginning of our country. It goes back to George Washington. I consider it the traditional staffing for presidents. George Washington went to Congress and said that I can't run the executive branch by myself. I need some helpers. And so Congress authorized departments like the State Department and the Attorney General and the Postmaster General and what was then the Department of War. Now we would call it the Department of Defense and the Department of the Treasury, for example. These cabinet agencies are the major federal agencies of government. They're headed by a secretary, so you hear it in the name, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, etc., who is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. I personally believe that the cabinet as an institution is very weak. However, individual secretaries may be very powerful if they happen to be trusted by the president. Now, your book points out and adds some evidence. Here's one where your textbook and I are in complete agreement. Greenberg and Page point out that most recent presidents convene their cabinet very infrequently. And when they do meet with cabinet secretaries, they may meet with one or two of them at a time and very rarely convene the whole cabinet. I put a concept down that I want you to put 5 stars next to. It's one that you're likely to see on the final exam, and that is going native. You guys know how I love sayings by the Nixon people. This was a phrase that was coined by John Ehrlichman. John Ehrlichman said, "White House secretaries come here to the White House, they eat our food, they drink our booze, then they run off and marry the natives." And what he meant was that often cabinet secretaries are enemies to the president because over time they lose their loyalty to the president and adopt the views of their agencies. First of all, many cabinet secretaries are chosen for political considerations and may not have that much loyalty to the president anyway. But the point is that even those that do have some loyalty to the president, they lose them because over time they begin looking out for the agency they represent rather than the president. At the bottom of the page, I have the Executive Office of the President. You should put some stars next to the EOP, or the Executive Office of the President, was created after recommendations by the Brownlow Commission, headed by Louis Brownlow, that recommended permanent staffing for the president. The president, in this case Franklin Roosevelt, had a smaller staff to guide the United States through the Great Depression than Michelle Obama had to help her with her job as First Lady. It's kind of scary. In my notes, the only agency that I have for you to know, and I'll give you a couple more, is the Office of Management and Budget. You should know that the Office of Management and Budget is the agency that prepares and administers the federal budget. They also control the release of funds to various agencies. But I would point out that there are other significant agencies in the executive office of the president. For example, the Council of Economic Advisors advises the president on economic policy. The most powerful foreign policy agency in the executive office of the president is the National Security Council, often referred to as the NSC. The National Security Council advises the president on foreign affairs, particularly in crisis situations and covert operations. The office of the vice president is also part of the executive office of the president. Up until recent times, the vice president was really essentially only powerful because they might become president if the president died. In more recent years, your book points out that vice presidents have become more powerful. Bill Clinton gave Al Gore significant powers in the arena of environmental policy. Barack Obama gave Joe Biden prominent foreign policy meetings with foreign leaders. President Obama also sent Biden in numerous times to negotiate with Congress over budgetary priorities in both 2011 and 2012. But your book, I think, points out the president who, without any question, gave his vice president more power than anyone else, and that would be George W. Bush. There is no question that Dick Cheney, who was George W. Bush's vice president, was really at the center of both foreign and domestic policy making. Dick Cheney actually was involved in helping select Supreme Court justices in a variety of things that we had never ever seen before in the role of a vice president. Your book also points out some people that I've mentioned earlier in what I would call the White House staff, and your book doesn't use that phrase. Your book instead calls this the institutional presidency. Certainly the chief of staff tends to serve as the president's right-hand man who manages the White House staff, and your book actually does mention Roosevelt's competitive model and Eisenhower's hierarchical model that I referred to earlier in an earlier lecture. The National Security Advisor is another crucial personal advisor to the president who heads the National Security Council. Without any question, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski were very active world-hopping diplomats playing that role as National Security Advisor. Certainly a key person that we've seen in the recent, more modern era is a high visibility role, and that is the press secretary. The president's press secretary holds press conferences, briefs the media, and is usually the day-to-day voice of the administration. So the point of the institutional presidency is that there really is a permanent bureaucracy, a large number of people associated with the presidency that really are there to help the incumbent, the current president, carry out their responsibilities. Once again, one of the things that is mind-boggling to me is that the current president, President Trump, ignores advice from his advisors probably more than any president that I've ever seen, certainly in my lifetime. In the next lecture, we start the